All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's find your seats so we can go ahead and get started, please. While we're waiting, and maybe just to kind of get caught up a little bit, there's our 3 objectives for today. So there's a space for your large group handout to be able to write down what the objectives are for today. There are 3, so I'll encourage you to go ahead and jot those 3 objectives down. As you can see by the title of the large group, we're going to be entering the decade of the 1930s, and a lot of the focus is going to be on the Great Depression today in my large group. So the letters GD there, the second time, stand for Great Depression. And those are the items I'm going to focus on. In the next 29 or so minutes, 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to you about the causes, and then what everyday life was like during the Depression, and then finally talking about the differences between the 2 presidents who will be serving in the Oval Office during the Depression, and that's Herbert Hoover and then again Franklin Roosevelt, and how they both react to the Great Depression. So those are the 3 highlights. That's how we have the handout broken up, and that's where we're going to begin. So the first part of the large group is going to be dealing with the causes. And so you see a subheading there on the very front page which talks about the causes, okay? And the handout has it divided into 3. So we're going to look at 3 major causes of the Great Depression to start. The first term on that list is over-speculation. I'm going to explain what over-speculation is first. It has something to do with the stock market and what it was doing in the 1920s. Okay? So, here we go. Over-speculation as one of the causes of the Great Depression. During the 1920s, the stock market is booming, folks, okay? Stock prices are rapidly increasing, okay? People are investing in the stock market, but here's the idea about over-speculation, the word speculation, that you're investing and buying stock with the intention that that stock is going to go up in price in the next month or in the next 2 months or in the next year. So you're buying stock with this idea that I'm going to sell it when it continues to go up. And if it does, I'm going to make lots of money, okay? And that is going to work for you as long as the stock price for these companies does go up. But here's the problem, as you can see, okay? In 1929, at the very end of that decade that we looked at in small group, you're going to have a huge crash. You're going to have a huge stock market correction. And the value of those stocks are going to go drastically down. And the problem of that is if you invested and bought when the stocks are high, and now all of a sudden the value of that stock is a lot less, you lose a lot of money. And of course, this is going to be one of the dramatic economic developments that happens at the very beginning of the Great Depression. And one problem of that is over-speculation. Did I buy stock in a company that was already overvalued, and I bought it thinking that it wasn't even going to go up more than what the company was actually worth? And that over-speculation is going to be a problem that some historians argue is an indication of the Great Depression to come. So that's your notes for letter A. Over-speculation of the stock market. But now letter B talks about some other concept, and that concept is called overproduction. So let me tell you a little bit about that as a cause of the Depression. It has something to do with farmers. So this is not dealing with the stock market anymore. Now we're talking about the farming segment of the economy. Okay? And generally speaking, during the 1920s, farmers are producing a lot more agricultural goods. Wheat, hay, corn, soybeans, you name any agricultural product, and farmers had been growing more and more by cultivating more land or by using machinery that was going to be more effective in producing more. And over time, what that's going to do is if everybody is producing more of that product, then the price of that product goes down. So in your notes, you want to put something like Because of a whole bunch of production or an increase in production, the prices for those agricultural products begin to go down. A bushel of wheat goes from like 25 cents to 13 cents, so almost 50% less in value, okay? You also have overproduction in the factories, industrial goods, manufacturing of cars, manufacturing of some of those new items that were being produced in the 20s, like washing machines. Companies were continuing to mass produce those, and then after a while, people aren't buying them at the same rate as they had been in earlier parts of the decade. So there's an overproduction going on with farming. There's also an overproduction in the industrial sector as well, in these mass-produced industries that I've just mentioned, okay? And after a while, you don't continue to buy vacuum cleaners and washing machines at that same rate as you did in the early 20s. And then, of course, businesses say, well, we have too much. We're going to have to stop producing and lay off workers or close some stores because business is not as booming as they were. So that's the second cause. Now I'm going to be telling you the third one here in just a second. It has something to do with credit and banking, which is the third subheading there in your handout. As you can see by this picture, something's going to happen in the late 20s once some of these economic sectors start to slow down, and that is there's a concern of how safe is my money in the bank? When I go but deposit money in the bank, how safe is it? Okay? And a bank run happens. Okay, the concept of a bank run is when you have like this, a whole bunch of people all at once going to the bank to withdraw their deposits. Okay, that's what a bank run is. And some of you might have seen movies that have scenes of bank runs. There's some old-time movies that are very famous for scenes that have bank runs. Okay? But when everybody tries to go to the bank at the exact same time and withdraw their money they have deposited there, that's called a bank run. And you need to know this, that a bank doesn't hold everybody's money when they deposit it. They turn around and lend it out in loans because that's the way the bank makes money. Okay? So therefore, there's no way that the banks have enough cash on hand to meet all these demands of these people who are running to the bank to get their withdrawal. And so what do banks do? They turn around and close their doors. And they shut down. And that's going to have a traumatic impact on the economy. When banks are not opening, banks are closing, you've got a panic going on, and you can't go get a loan because the banks have closed. And so people who do normally go to the bank to get a loan can't get one because many of these banks might be shutting down due to these bank runs. So you've got three major causes of the Depression that I wanted you to kind of understand. One is over-speculation, one is overproduction, and now this third one is this banking and credit crisis, where it's going to become harder to get a loan. And people's vision of a bank and their vision of, is a bank a good place to put my money, starts to be shaken. Their confidence level is shaken in that. And so we get to this bad depression. We get an economic slowdown like this country has never seen before. Okay? So my next thing here is, how bad is it? Well, just in terms of unemployment, the number of people who don't have a job, part of the labor force that is looking for work but can't find work. You might want to jot down that at its high point, about 25% of the workforce can't find work. Okay? So if you take all the people who were out there in the labor force seeking to find jobs, 25% could not find work at its high point. Okay? Now, if you actually take out farmers from that, it almost reaches a third. So if you take farmers out of that labor force and just talk about industrial workers and everybody else that's not a farmer, it gets to be almost like a third of the labor force is unemployed, like 32%. That's unbelievable high unemployment, okay? So that's one of our first ideas of trying to communicate to you how bad this economic slowdown gets, just looking at unemployment. I'll give you another little illustration of how bad things get when it comes to the industrial sector of the economy, how much businesses are producing in these mass-produced industries like automobiles and washing machines and cameras and radios and so on. They start to really slow down. A lot of these businesses start to cut back, lay off workers, okay? Sometimes by half. Imagine your workforce, you're going to cut them in half because we don't need that many on the assembly line. We don't need that many people working in your stores buying products because consumers are buying less because of the unemployment and the economic slowdown. Okay? Industries just stop producing, which is going to lay off workers, which is, of course, going to have an impact on unemployment. Okay? So there's a second little illustration of how bad things are getting with the economy. I'm going to give you another illustration of how bad things get. Okay? It has something to do with what happens in this part of the country, which we might call the Plains states. Okay? Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma. Okay? An event known as the Dust Bowl. Okay? A lot of drought starts to hit in the 1930s. Just summer and spring where there's hardly any rains. So it becomes very dry in the plains. And what does that cause? It causes the crops that are being planted to die out. And then there's windstorms. And on windstorms, that you have soil that had already been dug up to plant crops, but have no rain to hold down the roots, a lot of these dust storms like you see in the picture start to emerge. Just clouds of just tons of dirt being drug up by the winds and carried miles to the east, just as far as New York City in some cases, to where there's dust storms that originated in the plains of Nebraska and the plains of Kansas and Oklahoma that reach New York City and make New York City look like it's a cloudy, smoggy day when it really has something to do with the dust storms that are originating in places like Oklahoma. And that's going to cause a lot of farmers some problems. Farmers who are already struggling because of low crop prices are now struggling because some of these farms that they're living in these parts of the country are suffering from a drought. And they're losing some of their crop because of the windstorms. So that's just adding to the problems of the American farmer who's living in the plains. Some of them just get up and leave. Some of them just say, look, I'm tired of farming anymore. It's not going to be it's not economically effective. I'm leaving my farm. And they just leave everything and they start traveling to the nearby town or another community. Some of them travel west all the way to California to try to find a new way of life for themselves. And then sometimes they're going to be given negative nicknames like, oh, there goes the Arkies, there goes the Okies. They're leaving their farm and they're moving to a place like California just to be able to start a new living. And the Dust Bowl farmers, those who stuck around, are going to be struggling through these years of drought until eventually you get rainfall in these areas in which the storms don't occur anymore. Well, President Hoover is going to be in office when a lot of these things happen. And before we go there, I want to show you this brief little video to kind of give you more imagery on the Dust Bowl, okay? So this next little 3 to 4 minute clip, we'll talk more about the Dust Bowl and the storms, and then we'll talk a little bit about Hoover and his reaction to all these economic problems.
1934, darkness falls across America. The worst environmental disaster in American history. Dust storms hit New York, Chicago, and Boston. In Manhattan, the streetlights come on at midday. A monstrous dust storm 1,800 miles wide, from the Great Plains to the Atlantic Ocean. The air turns to earth. The storm carries 3 tons of dust for every American alive. Ships stop off the eastern seaboard, not sure what is happening. The cloud reminds the captain of the ship, the Deutschland, of the sands of the Sahara blowing out to sea. But now, the clouds are devouring the Statue of Liberty. Dust storms were born out of a 100 million acre dead zone, 2,000 miles away in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. The Great Plains had once been the most fertile grasslands on Earth. The topsoil was 6 feet deep, but it has been plowed up and used up by 4 generations of farmers. Now, the sun has dried it up.
What really did the farmers in was an environmental cataclysm that involved an extended drought, high winds, and the loss of millions and millions of tons of topsoil. It was almost as though the heavens themselves had turned against the farmers.
By 1930, the rains virtually stopped. The lighter organic matter, the best soil, is literally gone with the wind. The tiny particles of soil are suspended in the air. Then a freakish phenomenon happens. Static electricity builds between the earth and the dust. Like a magnet, the static electricity sucks up more and more dust, feeding itself, growing in size and power. A monster is created. The dust is lifted up to 10,000 feet. Powered by high-altitude winds, the monster rips across the country looking for prey. People tie themselves to ropes before going to a barn just a few hundred feet away. Cattle die, and when they are cut open, their stomachs are full of sand.
There are these memories of people that go for days and days and days, holed up inside of their little ranch houses, and they never see the light of day because the dust is so severe and it's so thick, over hundreds of miles. For days, they don't see light.
The tiny dust particles drill into the child's lungs. She comes down with dust pneumonia, the brown plague. The Red Cross set up 6 emergency hospitals in Kansas, Colorado, and Texas to deal with the rise of respiratory infections. Louise Walton had come to Colorado for the air. And now, doctors tell her that her little girl could die of it. There is an exodus of biblical proportions underway on the Great Plains. By 1936, farmers are losing $25 million a day.
Farming is no longer a possibility. The Great Depression takes hold. Their mortgage comes due, they can't pay it. They're not growing crops. They lose the family farm, they lose their identity.
A century before, 500,000 people had gone west on these same trails looking for hope. Now, 250,000 of them are fleeing the Dust Bowl in despair.
All right, so that gives you a little illustration of what's happening, you know, with it, whether it be physically becoming sick because of those dust storms, economically losing your farm. That's the reality in some cases of the Plains farmer in the early 1930s. And yet, what is President Hoover's reaction to all of this? And that's going to be my next part of the story, okay? Elected in 1928, President Hoover, the last Republican president of the decade, sees what's going on and says, well, my philosophy would stress that during times of trouble, individuals just need to become dependent upon themselves and just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, was the saying. Rugged individualism, that you just got to work harder and eventually take it upon yourself to eventually improve the lives of yourself and your families. And it's up to the individual to improve themselves. Don't look to the government. Don't look to the state to come and help out. That's not the role of the government. That would have been Hoover's philosophy mainly, that it was in the minds of people like him that said, look, during tough economic times, it's where people have to just kind of find their own solutions and work harder to improve themselves, okay? But a huge contrast is going to come to another politician that's going to have a very different point of view, But rugged individualism, okay, is this idea that it's not the role of the government to come in and give assistance. That would only make things worse, okay? That it's the need of the people themselves. Maybe rely on charity, rely on organizations to come in and help. That's fine if people want to give help, voluntary associations, but it shouldn't be relying on the government, okay? That will make things worse in the long run, okay? And over time, he does very little as President of the United States to have the government get involved. He does some. He does add some government assistance, but there was always in the back of his mind this idea of individualism, that rugged individualism idea, okay? One of the best illustrations of this rugged individualism comes in this part of the story. This is in Hoover's last year in office. There are World War I veterans, okay? And in World War I, the U.S. soldiers that had fought were promised a retirement pension. So once they served in the military for World War I, they said, look, when you get older, about 1945, give or take, you'll get a pension from the United States government. Well, now it's the 1930s. This is a decade before these retirement pensions are due. You have a whole bunch of military veterans say, look, we don't want to wait till 1945 to get our pension. They start demanding Congress to pay their pension early. Say, look, give us the money now when we need it during this Great Depression, and don't pay us in the 1940s when we get older. They were called the bonus army. That's who they were. We didn't call it a pension in those days. They called it a bonus. So if you want to put in your notes like pension army or bonus army, that's who they were. A bunch of World War I veterans who were marching to Congress, marching to Washington, D.C., gathering there, demanding that they get their bonus/pension early. Okay? And Hoover is listening to this as President of the United States. But Hoover, generally speaking, is saying, no, you don't rely on the government. The government will pay you your pension in the 1940s. He's not in favor of giving the pension early. And when all these people march to Washington, D.C. and start to stay there, almost living in what you might call now the space that is now in between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol building, that was all kind of grassy area in which these bonus army marchers were staying. He sent in the FBI and the military to go break it up. Send them home. Arrest them if you have to, but we don't want to have these people continuing to live here in D.C., continuing to demand and protest Congress. Now, that's not going to look very good in an election year when all of a sudden you have the United States military coming in and rounding these people up, as you do see here in this picture, and arresting them or breaking up their little temporary housing and forcing them to go back home. But that's the story of the bonus march. And it's going to make Hoover look, in some cases, very insensitive to the problems that some of these people are facing. So this next little 2-minute clip will give you an illustration of what it was like as part of this bonus.
It was May of 1932.
It's a spectacle unparalleled in the history of the country.
And something was very wrong in the land of plenty.
A day of bloodshed and riot.
There were those of us who felt that America was teetering on the brink of revolution.
For 3 years, the Great Depression had tormented Americans. Now, 20,000 Army veterans and their families came pouring into Washington to find out what the government was going to do about it.
They were bearded, they were ragged, they were desperate. You could see it in their eyes.
They'd been promised a bonus for their service in World War I, but it was not due to be paid until 1945. The desperate veterans wanted their money now. They were called the Bonus Army. On July 28th, the Bonus Army came to blows with Washington police. Shots were fired. President Herbert Hoover barricaded himself in the White House and called out the troops.
The soldiers have orders to burn down the unsanitary and illegal camps. And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic Bonus Army.
When the smoke cleared, 2 veterans and an infant were dead.
It was absolutely shameful. The sacrifice of the young American boys left such an impression on me, I have never forgotten it. They were just trying to feed their families.
Millions of Americans could no longer provide for their families. With nowhere to turn for help, they were angry and they were approaching their breaking point. 3 years into the Depression, the American system was in grave danger. Unless it could change and change quickly, it might not survive.
So let's not forget this is an election year in which this bonus army is coming to Congress demanding that Congress pass a law that would give them their pension early. And they're met with resistance, definitely not support, and eventually Hoover's ordered to rid the Capitol from these protesters and to force them to go home by destroying their temporary housing. This is going to make it look bad for Herbert Hoover, who's trying to run for re-election in 1932. Which leads me to my next part of the lecture, which is this election, this presidential election of 1932, where Herbert Hoover, the Republican, tries to run for another 4 years. And his opponent is going to be a Democrat by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sometimes known as FDR. Okay? So I'm going to introduce you to FDR in this next little video clip, and then I'll take you through the election and what becomes known as the New Deal.
Intelligent but not brilliant, pampered from birth as the only child of aristocrats, and crippled by polio, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was hardly predestined for a rendezvous with presidential greatness. But his political flexibility and infectious charisma made him perfectly suited to meet the unprecedented challenges of his presidency.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
Number 32, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat, 1933 to 1945, 51 years old, from New York.
FDR's difference from its predecessors was only a difference of degree, about 180 of them.
FDR was the fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a C student at Harvard, enjoyed sailing and stamp collecting. Although he could be very private, FDR brought an easy charm to the White House.
It must have been amazing to meet Franklin Roosevelt. Everybody talks about it, what a strong personality he had. Winston Churchill compared meeting him to opening your first bottle of champagne.
He was a person of enormous personal charm, but so many of his contemporaries say that at bottom they didn't know what made him tick, what was really going on behind what they frequently called the actor's mask of his face.
Mr. Roosevelt's daughter Anna said that he was very difficult to know, that no one really knew him. He was a loner.
FDR was stricken with polio at the age of 39. He was virtually confined to the homemade wheelchair that he personally designed using a kitchen chair. During his presidency, the handicap was downplayed.
He tried to be photographed standing, even though he had to lock these 10-pound leg braces to actually get in the standing position, and had to brace himself on something, a lectern or the arm of an associate.
Clinging to someone's arm, he could disguise his painful steps. He also had a customized Ford that he drove with hand controls. In newsreels, he appeared to be an able-bodied man.
What the newsreels wouldn't show was how he managed to get out of the car. He would have had to have been lifted out. All those images are kept from the public by choice of the media.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
FDR used radio to bring the presidency closer to the people. It is estimated that as many as 60% of Americans tuned in for some of his fireside chats.
Roosevelt was a master broadcaster.
So FDR is going to bring the new medium, the radio, to his favor. And his personality that, of course, people talked about in that video, people are going to be able to hear that voice and kind of also be attracted to this personality that gave a very, very different vision of the United States than the opponent, Herbert Hoover. FDR said, I have a new deal for the American people. And that new deal was action of the national government. He says, look, rugged individualism isn't going to solve the problems. he says it's going to take action of the national government to directly help the American people, to directly financially assist those that are unemployed, to take direct action to try to get Americans' faith in the stock market, in banking once again. It's going to take the direct effort of the national government to solve these problems, not rugged individual, not just let you people of the American country do this on your own. A very, very different vision, okay? And that promise of a New Deal was part of his speeches. And in 1932, of course, he's going to defeat Herbert Hoover, who's pictured on the left there, and he will become president now with a very different vision, a vision of a national government that is not going to sit back as charities come in and people do this on their own by pulling up on their bootstraps, but rather he's going to initiate all kinds of government programs and agencies that he argues is going to be necessary to get the economy going again. Okay? And so the nickname I want you to be aware of is this New Deal. That's the nickname for all these government agencies, these government programs that are going to be started. Okay? And he argues that these are meant to give people hope. The people were really down, thinking, this is terrible. The country's not going the right direction. But this kind of gave the country hope that, yes, something could happen that would be positive to get things going. And it's not our fault this is happening, but rather the government's going to come in and make a new approach to fighting this economic depression. Okay? Some of these programs are going to give people jobs. That's what we might call relief. Okay? By providing the unemployed people with work, building schools, building roads, building bridges. The federal government is going to initiate projects that are going to put people to work. Okay? Sometimes it's recovery. How do we get farm prices to go back up again? How do we get businesses to start producing more and for prices to start going up? So some programs are going to be meant to be recovery-oriented to get the economy going again. Like I said to you, for example, the farming economy, the industrial economy. How do you get prices to go back up? They've been going down for the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And then some of them are meant to be reform-minded. How can the government step in to regulate the economy to make sure something like this never happens again? Like, shouldn't we have a government agency that regulates the stock market? Shouldn't we have a government agency that regulates the banking industry? Shouldn't we have a government agency that will provide pensions to the retired peoples within this country so they don't suffer by not being able to take care of themselves? These are long-term reforms that are going to be happening under the New Deal. So whether they're recovery, relief, or reform, these are 3 goals of the New Deal that we want to make you aware of this. Okay? And we're going to be studying some very famous New Deal programs in small group that you will want to know for the test, and you'll want to know how they were attempting to try to solve some of these problems of the Great Depression. Okay? He will actually run for office 4 times. Only president to actually serve and be elected 4 terms. He will die in office in that first year of his last term, okay? But he will actually be president throughout the Great Depression and into World War II, which will be our next step of looking at American history. But the contrast that he has with Herbert Hoover will be one that still today in the modern era, 2020, 21st century that we're in, we're still living through the effects of the New Deal and this idea of the national government having a role to play in the economy and then helping those people who have economic problems. Okay? And some of these programs that were created still exist today that we're going to look at. Okay? Some of them don't. Some of them were meant just to be short-term relief types of things that weren't supposed to be permanent. But some of these things will live on still today, some 80 years later.